getting young people ready for field work. How do you support young people when they're doing field work, and what are the key considerations? And we'll be talking mostly about quality of field work in terms of interviews and focus groups, but we'll touch on kind of survey platforms and how you might want to go about that. The first thing I kind of want to cover is that how do you get ready for field work even before you start it, right? And firstly, it's about your responsibility as practitioners, right? So it's how do you get everything in place before you even get the young people going out there? So part of it is the fieldwork infrastructure, right? Thinking about what you're going to need, whether it's venues, if you don't have a place, what devices you're going to use to record. We talked previously about consent forms, but making sure that's all in place and understood as well. And just having all the paperwork ready, right? And participant communication and all of those things. Second one, we talked about this in the previous one, but making sure that everyone is up to date on safeguarding. They know who has the duty, they know what to do, and all of the things to make sure that before you start the field work, you can ensure that everything's going to be done safely. The next one is building skills and confidence. We'll touch on how you might go about that today, but this is really, really key to do before the fieldwork stage. Fieldwork stage is probably the most daunting because they're not in their peer research group. They are talking to others, right? They might be talking to older young people, strangers, maybe even practitioners who are sort of 20, 30 years older than them. So making sure that those young people are ready even before they'll work with those skills and confidence. The next one is observing, and how do you observe and how do you kind of support young people in those spaces during those interviews, but without interfering, right? Without kind of getting involved and not necessarily changing the direction of conversation. And then lastly, being responsible all time, not just for safeguarding, but well-being as well. So have a plan about how you're going to do debriefing, what well-being support there's going to be, and what needs to be in place depending on what you're doing. You know, a focus group with certain lived experience might be different to one-to-one interviews done online. I think kind of we've tried to boil down six common practitioner mistakes that we've done or we've seen. I mean, the first one is like doing it for them, especially if we see this with a practitioner doing an interview with a young person. It tends to be the practitioner dominating, and the young person gets relegated to either doing follow-up questions or maybe typing notes. That's wrong. It really should be in the place where the peer researcher is leading that conversation. There is a space for a youth worker or practitioner to be the co-interviewer, but it always has to be in a supportive role. Second one is just underestimating logistics, right? We have not, it's not just about young people. We've done peer research where the practitioners that they're interviewing don't get the consent forms back to us, right? Or the venue, there's something else going on in a different space and it's too loud and it spoils the recording. It's all of these kind of challenges, and making sure that you kind of have it all sorted, but you also do a test run of it as well. The next one is leaving it all to them. So there is an assumption that young people, because they're trained and you've done some interview practice, you kind of let them get on with it, or you let them do it alone, or you know they are perfectly capable of doing it. I think the thing is with all of qualitative research, and this is partly the challenge with peer research, you can teach them how to do an interview. You can spend a day doing practice interviews, but actually the best interviewers and the best people to run a focus group need existing a high level of soft skills, right? Being able to listen, being able to respond, but also really the confidence to interrupt people, to manage conversations as well. So I think there's a challenge that just because you train them up in how to do interviews, they are capable from the get-go of doing it, right? I think it's not assuming that they no longer need support and may no longer need additional training after it, right? So that's why you do the review process. What went wrong? What could you do better? And slowly building up their confidence, right? Their fourth interview that they would conduct will be very different to their first interview, right? Because you should see that progression as you go along. So this is the main point, skipping the debrief. And as part of that training process, you never skip the debrief, having that space, not just for safeguarding concerns, but actually what went well, what didn't go well, what follow-up questions did you have? Is the interview guide working? How did you feel during it, right? It's really, really important. The next one's overcorrecting the sample. And we'll talk about sample a little bit later, but it's about how you monitor those demographics for the people that you're trying to conduct fieldwork with. And then, you know, either overcorrecting, you know, oh, I don't have enough young men, and then you get an overrepresentation of young men, or you just fix it a little bit too late, right? You go, oh, I don't have many young men and I need to get them, but I've only got a week left and our organization doesn't really deliver with young men, and it's going to be so much harder. It's not going to be realistic within a week. And we'll talk about how do you monitor that. And then lastly, just not conflating your role with the researchers, right? And not getting your own agenda in, not reframing participants' answers, and not kind of try and dominate the research process. The thing that we would say is building a fieldwork ready team, right? They are a team, they have roles and responsibilities, and you make sure that they have four main things, right? They are competent, they've done it, they've had a practice of it, they understand the guide. You know, it's a bit of an unfair one, but we get them to try and say, can you tell me the questions on the interview guide without seeing it, right? Have you actually taken it in? Have you memorized it? I think that's quite an extreme way of doing it, but it is a really good practice to make sure that they are rehearsed and it's fluent and not alien to them. The second one is that safety part. Do they know the escalation pathways? Do they know what to do? Not just the safeguarding disclosures, but if they feel slightly uncomfortable, if the participant becomes distressed, especially if they're alone. Next one is valued, and this is what we mean by remunerations, right? Not just a remuneration structure for the peer researchers, but we're also in a minute going to talk about remunerations for participants. And then partly it's just about having a checklist, right? All of the things we've talked about. There is so much to remember. And fieldwork is kind of a culmination of all the work that you've done before, right? Making sure that the research question makes sense, making sure that the design and the research methods chosen make sense, making sure your interview guide is up to scratch and actually holding up and participants are responding well to it. It's the first opportunity to check that all of those things are actually well thought through and working in practice. It's also a good opportunity to make sure that you are catching anything that you've missed, you know, going over anything that you feel a little bit less confident about. And I think the checklist is really important for that. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is an example of the checklist. As always, we will send around slides to everybody. Sorry, Aspen, Polly couldn't find the link. Could you do me a favor and email the participants the Zoom link? Is that all right? Cool. As always, you'll get the slides. So, but it's just a good example of what's all the different things. I've not made you a co-host. Sorry. Let me just do that quickly. There we go. Right. And obviously the checklist depends, right? So if you're doing only survey work, this will be much, much reduced because you might not have the young people going out and using recording devices and doing in-person interviews. And then in terms of the planning timeline, this is the really important bit. It's about how do you proportion the amount of time that you need for it, right? So what do you need to get done 2 months before, 6 weeks before, a month before, 2 weeks before, and then the final week, right? So if you're thinking about the field work, we generally say it takes about a month or 2 months. If you're just doing interviews and focus groups and you have a lot of lead-in time, then you can get it all done in a month. But actually with field work, it's not so much about the amount of time that you portion to the field work itself. It's more about how far in advance you can start planning for it. If you have 6 months to prepare for the fieldwork phase, the fieldwork phase could be 1 week, right? Because you could spend 6 months planning 1 week where every single day you have interviews and focus groups, right? Generally, we say 2 months because it enables you to kind of do some planning before, right? Where you spend 2 months in organizing a couple of focus groups. And then in that first month, you do those focus groups. And then it gives you a second month to think about not scrambling, but kind of maybe thinking about, okay, what's missing? Who else do we need to engage with? Can we do it again or reiterate the interview guide and just kind of pick up any issues that you might go along? And also participant, recruitment takes a really long time. So you want to monitor that data, who is actually coming to those sessions. Dropout rates can be huge. So the 2 month kind of margin gives you a little bit more time to make sure that you're meeting your samples and checking your recordings and getting all of your consent forms sorted. Because really, also, all of that stuff needs to be done before you can move on to the next stage, which is analysis, right? Even the consent forms, you need to have it all signed off and then logged in before you do all of that. And then lastly, I mean, venue is a really important one. I think a lot of organizations, you will have your own venues. So this is probably not as relevant, but there's some basic stuff, just neutral, not kind of formal or associated to authority or institution that they might have a negative experience of. Quiet enough to record. I mean, AI is really good now. This used to be more of a problem 2 years ago, where if you had a little bit of noise on the recording, it completely throw off the automatic transcripts. But still, it just makes your life so much easier. And even still, you're going to need to check the transcripts. You need to get someone to physically listen to it to make sure that they're correct. And all of that is just so much easier when it's quiet enough. And if you're doing it online as well, we've had people do online interviews for peer research, and they are on a bus, really, really loud, and it's just been a nightmare. So dedicated space, private and quiet. And privacy is the really good one. You can have glass walls and things like that. It's not even just about being listened to, it's about being observed as well. I think if the young person cannot be seen by anyone, it creates a more honest conversation. It's like that glass buildings make you more honest. In this case, glass walls and windows make participants less honest because they can't open up in the same way. And then some basic stuff like youth worker stuff, make sure that they can get there, that there's physical accessibility, transport links, they know where to get to. It's not really hard to find. And also make sure it's open and available during the right time. And then fieldwork risk assessments. We're all pretty attuned to doing fieldwork risk assessments. We maybe hate sometimes doing risk assessments, but it's really, really important. But think about the specific risks that will come about through the research methods that you're using. So safeguarding disclosures, participant distress, peer researcher safety. And then I think the one I want to focus on is topic related risks as well. So what is the specific things in the interview guide that might come up? What are the predicted follow-up questions that might go down a certain path? And then how do you feed that into the risk assessment? And what's the plan if that happens? So the way to always think about fieldwork stage, that even just before doing it, and we said this is the toolkit as well, it's a point of no return, right? Once you kind of start it, it's relatively fixed. I've talked about reiterating an interview guide and improving it as you go along and testing it. But really, that the scope to do that is limited. You can do small changes, small iterations if you find problems or challenges that necessitates it. But really, for consistency, you want everything to be set, right? You don't want to ask 10 different questions every interview. So really, it's the place where you check everything is sorted. You check all of the risks are accounted for. You check the interview guide works, and then you just get on and start with it, right? But it really should be considered a point of no return, because then I think it really focuses organizations to really get everything sorted before they start the field work, rather than kind of leaving it and trying to build a plane as it flies. I'll talk quickly about advertising recruitment participants, the kind of practical side of it. There's really a challenge with participants, and recruitment is way harder than sometimes I think people think. There's the usual suspects problem. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. Usual suspects tend to be the easiest to recruit as well. You really have to examine that research question and what the point of it is and which communities it's specifically going to reach. If you're doing a piece on unemployment support, then do you have a focus group that is just neat young people, or do you make sure that you have young people who are neat within your interviews, right? What are the different groups and what are going to be the additional challenges in terms of getting them recruited for this, right? Second one is participant recruitment takes way longer than expected. Whatever you estimate, I would add 50% to it as kind of a general rule. This changes though. If you have young people in your organization that you're delivering services for and they're coming in and out, then it can be different. Similarly, gatekeepers, if you are a youth club and you have youth workers who know people who'd be perfect, this is going to take way less time. But if you don't have those if you don't have those gatekeepers, you don't have those young people in-house, those are the best ways to do it, right? Talk to youth workers at a youth club rather than necessarily leadership, and find out the specifics of those different young people and their lived experience, and see if they are the right young people in terms of that, what you need for your research question. And then lastly, generic messages. We find that the more specific the topic is, the more specific the messaging can be, right? So it's not how can you improve the local offer for care experienced young people? It's, how can we look at improving mental health services in Hackney for local care experienced young people, or whatever it is, right? Trying to find people with that interest or, lived experience, which leads to their interest in taking part. Advertising channels. We use a lot of WhatsApps. I have so many WhatsApp groups. Generally, it's more about youth workers also WhatsApping and messaging people. Emails do not work, so it's all about WhatsApping and seeing if they're free. If you have Instagram or TikTok, this kind of works, but the conversion rate's not great. You don't see loads of people necessarily joining on. You see partner organization newsletters like advertising it out works because it reaches the gatekeepers and the gatekeepers recruit, especially if there's a good remuneration structure. Schools and colleges, I think generally you find is probably one of the most effective and easiest if you have a way of getting in, right? If you've got a teacher who's particularly motivated. Otherwise, if you have no access into that school, it's really, really difficult. In-person intercept, huge conversion rate, right? Just going out onto the streets and doing it. I know there's young street advisors in Southwark. I can't remember what they're called. They do that, where they just go out onto the street and talk to people. Really, really good, really high conversion rate, much higher threshold in terms of the soft skills needed and the confidence needed to do that. That would terrify me, let alone if I was a young person doing peer research. And then printed flyers and QR codes. I'm not sure how super effective this is. I've seen it more effective for older groups, sort of 50, 60. I haven't heard anything too strong about young people, but you know, maybe for children on libraries if you're going through gatekeepers and schools. Um, Writing recruitment copy, the general guidelines is be really specific with your lived experience in that first sentence. So your age range, specific area, what lived experience you're looking for. It's being really transparent about the time commitment that it will take, the incentive, even the time commitment if they have to travel, how long would it take, account for that. If it's the incentive, what form is it going to come in? Is travel going to be covered? Is there going to be food provided? If there is, say explicitly, and then really focus on the impact. So it's all of the kind of practical stuff, and then what is the point of this, right? Why are we doing this? Not who's it funded by or what the research question is. What is it directly going to try to influence or improve locally that will impact their lives? Make the next steps really easy. We just do QR codes or emails. We never get emails, QR codes. So much easier if they could just fill something in and then we can contact them afterwards. And then also make the peer researchers front and focus. We did two projects. The one project had all five of the peer researchers in a picture on it. The other one didn't. The one with the peer researchers based and named on it did really, really well because they can see who, if this is being youth led, it's coming from young people, they're more likely to engage with it. And then lastly, working with gatekeepers. I won't go too much into this, but obviously it's about tailoring your recruitment strategy depending on where you're going. Schools and colleges, you might go to the head of year, you might come with an explanation. I tend to find it's better when there is an offer to the schools, like how you might give them a split of the data specifically for their young people, thinking about how it might fit in with the curriculum or PSHE or other stuff that teachers have to do as well. I would always do far greater amount of resources in terms of a resource pack. So slides about the presentation, scripts, QR codes, all of that. So the teachers have something very easily just to present to young people in that classroom setting is always appreciated, which is very different to youth workers, right? Well, youth workers, they have really good relationships. It's more of an informal conversation. I think youth workers focus far more, in my experience, on are the young people getting paid? Is there a budget for food? All of that stuff. They're really thinking about what the young people are going to get out of it. That's great. Specialist services. Yeah, this is only when you're doing very specific lived experience work. So, a CAM centre is far more likely to support this work if you are being commissioned by NHS London or whatever it is. It's thinking about what is that systems approach and how does that specialist service feed into that systems approach. And then employers and faith communities, it's just when they're delivering services, how do you slot it into it, right? So if they are doing lunchtime slots, if they're there for apprenticeships anyway, it's thinking about if faith communities are doing something on the weekend or they've got a workshop, how do you fit into it? So it's with employers and faith providers and other services, it's about what is their timeline and building it into it rather than asking for a specific recruitment, a specific time. And then recruiting, managing the pipeline. I mean, you can read all of this here. The thing that I really think is there's a couple ones. Live spreadsheet, just data Excel it within an inch of its life. Make sure that you're tracking all the people coming, tracking their vouchers, making sure that they are being sent reminders. I would always book 20, 30 more 25% participants. It's like an event, just assume, I mean, with events, we assume 25% dropout rate. With this, I would go closer to 30%, even maybe 40%. I would budget for more participants, and then just, if you use all of the budget, that's great, but understand that it's probably going to have a huge dropout rate, especially if it's in person. Um, and yeah, just track demographics as you go along, right? So you're making sure that you're adjusting for it. And if you've got a waiting list, then you can selectively sample, right? So you select more of the men or the women or whatever it is that you need. So examples of recruitment, specifically, Intel University, they use peer researchers. They did a snowball sample where each peer researcher invited 3 or 5 young people that they knew. Um, that could be a danger in terms of usual suspects or whatever, but their friends might not necessarily be usual suspects, and it's about briefing those peer researchers, saying, "Hey, I want 3 or 5 young people from each of you, but don't just recruit your friends. Remember what this is about. This is the specific topic. Try and get them to think a little bit like a researcher in terms of how do you sample participants." Groundwork in London, they partnered with 12 CAMS key workers, again, going through those gatekeepers who identified participants with that specific lived experience. And that's also great from a safeguarding point of view, right? Because they'll identify participants who have those experience of accessing mental health services, but they might make a little bit more of a reasoned judgment about who is at a point where they can participate safely, right? Hackney Council did it very differently with their housing needs survey. They just set up survey stations, right, at 4 food banks and 2 community centres, and they recruited 280 through in-person intercept. And what I mean by that is this is a really good one for quantitative data. We'll talk about survey platforms. In-person survey work is always underestimated. If you get a peer researcher with a laptop and go to a youth club and get them to spend a couple of hours there and have some chocolates or sweets or whatever, you will get so many survey responses in person for an hour's work than you would necessarily paying Facebook advertising and all of it, right? Sampling, I think sampling is the most important bit. It's probably the trickiest thing to do, especially with less capacity or resources. I think the way to always think about it is what is the population that you're looking at? So if you're looking at 16 to 25-year-olds, in a certain borough, the first thing you do is Google how many 16 to 25-year-olds, right? That's your overall population. And then you try and narrow it down. So how many have used this health service in this local area? And then you just you might have that data from that health service where we had 10,000 people come through the door and 2,000 of those people were aged 16 to 25. Then you know what your population is. You're looking at a population of 2,000 young people, right? And then the sample is how do you kind of make an accurate representation of that population, right? You can't interview or talk to all of those 2,000 people, right? So typically you can make a judgment about how big that number is. The rule is the more representative of all of the different nuances of that population, the smaller your sample can be. So, for example, I can't even remember how many people live in the UK, like 56 million or something ridiculous. YouGov surveys, polling companies, they'll do polls of voting intentions. They will be accurate, like the exit polls or whatever, to like 1 or 2%. But they only sample 1,200 people. But they sample that 1,200 people so effectively that it can make a pretty 95% accuracy of 56 million or whatever it is, right? You will probably not get to that level of representativeness, but there are some basics, right? So gender, ethnicity, age, right? Make sure you've got 50% women, 50% men, whatever it is, non-binary, depends on what the topic you're looking at. Make sure the ethnicity, if you're in an area where there is, 30% Afro-Caribbean young people, you kind of need that reflected in the sample. There are ways, especially when the survey, that you can overweight and underweight, and we'll talk about that in analysis. But that's kind of a statistical trick, really. In some ways, the better it is in the sample, just the more representative it is broadly, anyway. And age as well. So loads of surveys or interviews, they'll be like, we're looking at 16 to 25s, and then 80% of the sample will be 23 and 25, right? So making sure that if you're saying age 16 to 25, how balanced is it across that age group, right? And then the next one is about purposeful sampling. And this is kind of about that representative stuff about gender ethnicity, but it's about specific lived experience. And it's not just having that lived experience, but also thinking about the the opposite side. And by that, I mean, if you're doing a piece of research on a park, you don't just get the lived experience of young people who use the park. You, in this case, would also want the lived experience of people who just aren't interested in the park and don't use it whatsoever. So people who use CAMs, people who don't use CAMs but might need it, right? And thinking about all of those different lived experience. Again, with the unemployment one, you don't just want neat young people. You want neat young people, you want unemployed graduates, you want people who have got a job but have insecure employment. Think about all of the different experiences, negative or otherwise, that someone can have about employment or underemployment or unemployment, and then think about how you do bits of research with each of them, if that is how broad your research question is. In terms of sampling size, just the guidance that we generally use is we tend to say minimum 12 in-depth interviews. I think you can actually do less depending on whether you're doing focus groups as well. You know, if you're doing 2 focus groups with 5 young people each, that's 10 young people. Surveys, interviews, I would do 6 or 7. And it depends on how long they are as well. Generally, with young people interviews, we say it's about 20, 30 minutes should be the guideline. In realistic terms, we tend to have an average of like 15. You know, you'll have one peer research doing an interview and it will last like 7 minutes. That is not good. And we would have to debrief and talk to them about it and think about how they get it to go a little bit longer and how you tease out those answers. But it's already been done. So inevitably, some of your interviews will be really, really short. So it kind of depends on how long they are, how in detail they are, and also how they're being supplemented with focus groups. With surveys, I would say a minimum is 100. Even if you're just looking at one specific location, 100 is a really good one. I think there's a psychological thing where 100 sounds good. I think good targets for a local authority based one is around 300 to 500. If you're doing something regionally for a whole city, it'd be closer to 1,000. But as you can see, it's like, not diminishing terms, it's exponentially smaller, right? If that makes sense. A local authority, there's 32 different local authorities in London. 300 to 500 is a good one. But if you double that, somehow that makes sense for London. But it's the way that representative samples work, right? If you have a representative sample of 1,000 for London, you know, that's pretty good. And also there is the basic thing about data literacy and who you're influencing, right? Policymakers will listen to a survey of 300, 500, 1,000. All of the stuff that I'm saying about sample, you might get some people who are interrogating it a little bit more and actually go, well, actually, you've got no representation of this or that. But if you generally come with 500 young people or 1,000 young people, those kind of statistical rigorous points tend not to get interrogated as much, which is bad and it speaks to data literacy. But in terms of influencing, it's this thing where like quantitative data and large number surveys always have an impact and are less scrutinized about how good that sample actually is. And then similarly, interviews is the opposite, right? Where you might do 10 interviews and they are really fantastic, really good lived experience, really in-depth conversations. And policymakers just see it as 10 interviews, right? So there is some practical considerations to sample in terms of research quality and integrity. And there are kind of more psychological considerations to sample in terms of what you're trying to achieve and who you're going to influence. So I've said this before, but it's just about monitoring. So set your demographic targets, understand what ONS data says about your population, and think about what you're working towards. Export it if you have a platform weekly, put it in the Excel sheet after the interviews, make sure you have all that data and you have it so you can identify those gaps weeks before the end of the field work. Make sure that you can contact those gatekeepers, make sure you start building up a bit of a waiting list of those participants that you might think will be harder to reach or, you know, whatever it is. And then adjust the outreach, right? So just change your strategy. If you're only getting women one way, then it might not just be going harder. It's about actually, is there a complete different way, right? Is there a whole different organization who specifically work with, say, young men that we can contact about this? And then also just be transparent, right? And be realistic about what you can achieve within the timeframes that you've got. You might not be able to do this huge representative sample, in which case you go, look, our main goal is to make sure we've got 50% men, 50% women. That's fine, as long as you're really transparent about those limitations. And then also get peer researchers involved in this. We teach peer researchers about samples and populations. We assign roles and responsibilities. It will be one peer researcher's role to check the survey data, to identify and feedback on our group sessions, which ones were missing, and then they can kind of formulate a plan together themselves about how they might do that, which tends to be snowball sampling stuff, like who can I get in my school to do it to up the thing. But just getting them involved in that process is really important because actually they're the most effective people in terms of getting a sample. We had one peer research project in Tottenham where all of the survey participants were recruited from those peer researchers. There were about 30 peer researchers ranging from the age of 16 to 70 because it was an intergenerational thing. They got a sample of about 600, right? And the council was shocked at how good the sample was because all of the 600 came from one ward, like you could walk within a couple of minutes. But the reason they did it is because they were motivated, they were remunerated for survey results. If they got a certain amount of participants, they got additional bonus or whatever. I mean, it's slightly payment by results. I think you have to think about what the ethics that you want in terms of paying and doing it that way. But the basis is they do know people, right? That's the point, right? And if they are motivated to find those people, they will find people who do not engage with anything that the council does or any surveys or whatever because they have that trusted person in their life asking them to do it. So they're a really powerful tool if you involve them. Remuneration of participants. I'm going to be a little bit quicker here. Because I'm conscious of time, we always say you have to remunerate participants. You might just give them pizza but there has to be some sort of thing for them. Not only does it widen participation, it acknowledges the real challenges, it makes sure that you're not perpetuating economic inequality. It produces better data as well, as opposed to like a voluntary thing that a youth worker kind of goes, come on, let's go do this. They are paid to be a participant and it slightly changes it as well. They are more likely to attend, less likely to drop out. And the main thing is it should be a thank you, right? It's always framed as a thank you. It's not a transaction because there is no, you say nice things about us and we pay you. And that's why the payment should always come from the research organization, not necessarily the youth club, right? Because then if the youth club administers the vouchers, sometimes that's easier, but then you have to think about what the power dynamic is of that. In terms of how and the amount, it's so different. I'll talk about the type first. Very few ever do cash payments anymore. I don't really see it very much. The most common ones are gift vouchers like Love to Shop or supermarket vouchers. There's Amazon and things like that. Generally, young people don't like them as much, but I think that's because they're not adequately explained. Like if you explain generally Love to Shop and the vast range of retailers, they're kind of happy with that anyway. We tend to pay £20 per participant, and that will either be for an interview or a focus group. We don't tend to pay less than that, regardless of whether it's an interview or a focus group. And the thing is, and we've taken advice on this, cash payments and vouchers do count as cash payments. So they should be reporting it to HMRC, and there's a whole thing there. So, the best way to do it is you make them aware of some of the tax implications that they might face, but also ensure that it is always a gift and a thank you, and it isn't tied to the amount of time that they do. This also applies to peer researchers, right? So you don't go, well, you've done 2 hours, that's £20 an hour, so it's £40, right? It's just a one-off. And that's why we pay £20 regardless of whether you do an hour or 30 minutes, because it's not tied to time worked and earnings like a job. It is just a thank you for taking part. And travel reimbursements are fine as well. I think travel reimbursements are really, really important if they're doing it in person. With surveys, it's a little bit trickier, right? And surveys is more about it's not necessarily about all of the other ethical justice stuff around socioeconomic and necessarily widening access. We generally see survey remuneration as just a recruitment tool. So we do prize draws, 1 to 5. I generally have this sense that having a big prize draw gets more young people interested. And I still feel like that's true in my soul, but we've done loads of interviews and qualitative work where actually young people kind of see through that and they are more interested in a number of prizes. We've always tested it, and every single focus group always says we'd rather have 10 prizes of £50 than one prize of £500. The big thing doesn't get them. They always look at how many prizes there are. There's also other incentives as well, and this is through gatekeepers. If we can set up a laptop in your youth club and get a peer researcher and get your young people to do the survey on the laptop, we'll provide a pizza budget or equipment fund or whatever it is. And it creates like an event, it creates something to do, but it also gets external stakeholders involved and on board in helping push that survey. There's the instant rewards as well, snacks, chocolates, sweets, pens, £2 to £5 vouchers, right? If you have a budget and you want 100 young people to do a survey, if you give them £2 coin each, that's £200 to get 100. I mean, most organizations I would think would take that, but think about how that works and in person and carrying cash and all of the considerations. But the actual incentive of instant rewards is really, really effective. Um, then there's the data for change framing, being really clear about where the data is going to go, who's it going to influence, all of that stuff. You could also do signposting as well. So, they can put their emails and you can collect their data as long as it's GDPR compliant and then signpost them to other services. It's a really good recruitment tool in terms of your programs and your delivery as well, because if they're motivated enough and interested enough to complete a 10-minute survey on, say, sports and mental health, and you're a sports organization, this is the prime people for recruitment into your services. And then sometimes people just don't have any incentive, right? You don't have any financial incentive. It's just them who are interested in that topic. TfL consultations do really high numbers because you have a huge number of the population who are just interested in the future of transport in London, and they will just do it anyway. But you'll find a challenge where you get the most interested people doing it. If you do something on LTNs, you find that loads of people who are anti-LTNs, they have their own networks, they spread it, and you'll get a huge anti-LTN segment within that consultation. So it's about thinking about, if there is no incentive, why are the people who are doing it doing it? Very, very clear, just some basic stuff. Just keep a log of it. Think about thresholds. Think about the guidance from HMRC and how do you tell that to participants you're doing your duty on it. Collect very minimum data, pay really quickly. I think as soon as a young person or a participant has to chase their youth worker or chase you about where their voucher is, or they're not sure when they're going to get it, or they haven't got it for a week, that really undermines trust. So make sure that you give it to them as soon as possible, or at least tell them the latest it will be paid, right? And then also there's some fantastic voucher management systems where you can send it to them and you can check that they've collected it, you can check that they've used it as well. And then that now enables you to kind of do follow-ups, being like, hey, we sent you the voucher, but we see you haven't used it for a month or so, just checking that you've got it and everything's okay. Some examples of practice. So Catch 22, similarly, they do £20 vouchers for all participants and they send it within 24 hours. No bank details, 0 late payments. Fantastic. Refuge do supermarket vouchers over cash because, again, safeguarding concerns around cash. I think cash is really tricky, especially sending a young person home with cash. Shelter, with their 400-person survey, did a price draw fund, again, 3 times 75. And they had to collect emails, and you collect the emails at the end of the survey, which ensures that your completion rate is a lot higher. And then Hackney Youth Council, they didn't have any financial remuneration. But again, it comes from the council, so it has that institutional authority. Young people implicitly understand that a survey coming from the council will probably have more influence or impact because they are the decision makers. So, and if it's a topic about transport, they are more likely to do it. We had a survey that was about the potential scrapping of the Zip card, free transport for under 18s. We didn't have any incentives, and that went up to like over 2,000 young people, just because people are super interested in it. They heard about it in the news and they wanted to protect their free transport. So they were super motivated to do the survey. Next, and this is kind of one of the key bits, is about training young people for qualitative research. And we have a whole training session about doing it, not just the design of it, but we generally bring young people together for a day's training on just practicing public speaking, interview guides, and if you need to do it, if it's a part of your methodology, focus groups as well. This is the kind of breakdown. We talk about the conceptual stuff about interviews, how it's different, what their role is as an interviewer, as opposed to just kind of a conversation. It's like a sleight of hand trick. You want the peer researchers to be doing an interview, but to the participant, it just feels like an honest, open, non-judgmental conversation. But for the peer researcher, it isn't just a conversation. It is a real kind of professional exercise in active listening, how to do open questions, doing interesting probes, and how do you use silence as well. We will do the links to the resources, qualitative research methods. We design each one for each different project that we do. So they all look really different. And my documents folder is filled with like 17 interview training PowerPoints. We are in the next stage, I think in the next couple of months, going to think about how we get all of those kind of more broad interview training. Basically, yes, we are planning to do it, but it's not ready yet. The next one is interview question analysis. So go through the interview guide again, think about how they might want to do it, get them to start scribbling follow-up questions that might come up afterwards. We always do a demonstration in front of everybody. So two people sitting in front, and then we pause the demonstration and then ask the group about what follow-up questions they might have asked, what they might have done differently, how they would react to certain answers. We also get the role playing as well. So whoever is the research participant, they will get a brief on a piece of paper, which is unknown to the rest of the group, and the brief will be a certain archetype, like silent or you know combative or whatever it is, just so they can practice or see a demonstration of how you deal with someone who does one-word answers. This is the most important bit. Generally, we actually do longer than 45 minutes, actually. Sometimes it could be an hour and a half, even 2 hours. The best way to do it is to do practice of it. And also the practice stuff counts as a part of your research field work, right? If your peer researchers are recruited because they have that lived experience of that topic, they 100% should be a part of the field work. So actually, your first round of data collection should be in that practice where they are doing those one-to-one interviews with each other and then switching or changing groups as well. And also having that reflection about here, what did you want to talk about that you weren't asked about, right? And how do you bring that into when you do the interview and things like that? And then debrief group conversations, right? That's just that general thing. What was hard? What felt good? What questions worked well? And then also you can do a bit of a reiteration of the interview guide there. The main thing we teach and everything, all of the exercises we do kind of break down into it is about this idea of active listening, right? So we talk about how do you listen with your eyes, with your body, how do you make sure that the participant knows that you're actively listening, not just passively. The one that we always say is quoting them back to them. How can you, when you're doing a follow-up question, use an exact quote from what they've said to show that you've listening, and it frames your question by specifically talking about what they say. It's all those minimal encourages like, okay, great, yeah, thank you. And it's about a balance of how do you do all of those body language and minimal encourages without coming off as fake or cringe, as young people have said, right? You don't want to seem too fake when doing it, but just how would you do it, right? And each young person does it differently. So it's about how does each young person actively listen in a way that's true to them and comes off authentic, right? The other part of it is also making sure that you are listening to understand the full breadth of what's being said. What we find is peer researchers will listen to the first part of the answer and go, I've got a really good follow-up question and I really don't want to know more about that. And they're too busy thinking about what their follow-up question is, the first part of the answer, that they miss the second and third part of the answer. So really we try and teach them what's the whole thing that they're hearing. And we do this in a way where we do some exercises where we give participants a really long answer to give, and then we just test them on what was said, right? Like, who did they say their best friend was, right? And just kind of gamifying it a little bit, but teaching them that they have to almost commit to memory all of the key bits of information. And if we give them a paragraph on screen of an answer, it's about getting them almost like when they do like a history test or whatever, and they have to highlight the key aspects of the question to really understand what that question's about. Same with the answer. How do you underline the key parts of the answer and really take in the information content blocks from it? 5-second rule as well. With the main thing with active listening, we always teach them to be comfortable with silence, right? Young people, especially if they're meeting a stranger, silence is really uncomfortable. Generally, as humans, if we are feeling uncomfortable, we tend to feel silence with talking. Peer researchers need to be able to understand how that works psychologically, but then use it as a mechanism, not to make the participant feel uncomfortable, but to allow that person to continue talking if there's more to be said, right? Not jumping in, not cutting them off, not moving on to the next question, giving that 5 seconds, letting them kind of finish their answer, then thanking them, then kind of moving on as well. And then also with follow-up questions, it's always the unexpected. So what stood out? What surprised you? What was unexpected about their answer? That's the thing you should talk more about. This gets easier because after they've done 4 interviews, for example, they start to hear the same things again and again. And that's a really good rule in terms of your participant numbers as well. You know, how many interviews do you do? 5, 6, 7, 10, 12? The guidance we always give is it's about when the interviews start to become samey, right? When you've done 5 interviews and you stop hearing new things by the 5th interview, then you're starting to get a bit more of a representative sample because you're starting to capture all of the things related to this topic. So really look out for the unexpected, and that's what they should focus their follow-up questions on. And then just practice some prompts with them as well. What's a neutral probe? How do you do it? How do you basically invite the person to speak more about a specific thing? So neutral probes, I mean, there's general ones like, can you tell me more about that? How does that make you feel? What happened next? We always clarify probes with quotes. So you said that you didn't feel accepted and blah, blah, blah. What do you mean by that? Can you give me an example? Staying super neutral, we talked about leading questions, but that can kind of sometimes go out the window with follow-up questions. So it's making sure that peer researchers still stay neutral, even with their follow-up questions and their probes. And then also participants getting emotional or distressed as well, and making sure that young people understand it's not just their safeguarding responsibility, but this idea of more pastoral care, right? How do you make sure that you provide reassurance that you're not pressuring them, you're not barraging them with questions, and how do you recognize those risks? How do you recognize these changes in body language? You know, if the participant's doing this, if they start avoiding eye contact, we get them to kind of cite on a piece of paper as a group, what are the different ways that you identify risks? What does that look like in an interview? And what should you be doing as a result, right? It's a step lower than safeguarding risk and disclosure. It's more just about general practice and making people feel comfortable. And this is part of it as well. You know, what do you do with these different difficult situations? And this is the stuff that you can role play really, really well. The most common one is participants giving one-word answers. How does the peer researcher kind of mitigate that? And then what does the practitioner do, right? And we teach them about what they should be doing, but then also it's really important to think about what the practitioner does. So, for example, with one-word answers and going off topic, I think that's for the debrief. You know, that's why we encourage you to do more interviews than you probably need, because the first few is going to be a real learning process. And then you talk about it in the debrief. Either you sit in and listen to it, or you listen to the recording as soon as possible. You can give a really detailed debrief about how that interview went. With stuff around uncomfortableness or disclosures, that is far more hands-on from participants. You know, I think a lot of it, if you're looking at a sensitive topic like youth violence or mental health, I actually do think the youth worker or practitioner should sit in on the interview. We tend to say sit in the back of the room outside of the eye line of the participants. The participant doesn't feel observed, but listening to that and making sure that you are present in the room just in case is really important. And if the participant challenges the research itself, you know, I think this doesn't happen so much because participants understand peer researchers are just trying to do their job and they come from a good place and things like that. But, you know, practitioners might want to do a debrief, but also a debrief with the participant, you know, listen to the participant after the interview, listen to why they have concerns, and then either relay those concerns or be transparent that they are correct in certain elements or whatever it is. But you don't want to just focus on the participant. You also want to, the peer researcher, you also want to focus on the participant. So staff support really clearly before the session, you set up the space, you do all the logistics. During the session, you might be out of sight, but in the room or nearby, depending on the topic. That's kind of up to you. But, you know, agree a sign of how they need help, make sure that you can intervene if it's needed. But don't intervene if the peer researcher makes like research errors, like a slightly leading question or not a great probe or whatever. That's the stuff that you talk about in the debrief. You only kind of intervene if it's like safeguarding or disclosures or distress or something a bit more challenging. And then do the immediate debrief while it's still fresh in their mind, right? Don't leave the debrief to like a week away because they won't remember anything. Like build that time in between the interviews where you have 10, 15 minutes to talk about how it went before they go into their next interview. Because then they have a real opportunity to learn from interview to interview. And then research wellbeing, the practitioner's responsibility. You know, and this is a clear one. We talked about it last session with safeguarding. I won't go into too much detail. So it's like re-traumatization. the field work can be physically demanding as well. If you've just got one interview that day, that's fine. But if you have a whole day at the youth club of back-to-back interviews, that could be really draining, especially depending on the topic being about poverty or violence or war or whatever it is. Um, and that secondary traumatic stress is the thing you have to worry about, especially if your peer researchers have that lived experience of that issue. Hearing stories from others about what they're facing might bring back their own stress and their trauma on it. And that's why you do the debrief. It's not just how can we improve the interview, what you went well. It's also how do you feel about it? How are you feeling after doing this interview? Is there anything that came up that you're stressed about, etc., etc. And then I think the well-being stuff does affect the actual data as well, right? So if the peer researcher is feeling anxious about a certain topic, they are just less likely to probe on that topic. But that topic might be the most important thing for your research, right? So making sure that they are feeling okay, they are feeling well, because then it will lead them to conduct more honest interviews as well. So, for example, we did a 15-minute debrief session after each piece of interview. And if they felt that they were a little bit more stressed or there was disclosure, we would have to do a longer debrief and then a welfare check the day afterwards as well, because I think some of it doesn't get processed to the day after. So they might be like, that was really difficult. That brought up some stuff, but I'm fine. And then the next day, that's when it really hits them. So it's making sure that you also have a welfare check the following day. In terms of focus group training, it's slightly different and you can build this in. We generally don't tend to train all the peer researchers in focus groups, partly because we don't have all the peer researchers doing focus groups. Let's say you've got 2 focus groups, you only need 2 to 4 peer researchers, so you might not need all of them. But if you were doing this in an afternoon session, it's kind of the same thing. It's how do you set up a room, teaching them why you do the crescent shape, right? We do that crescent moon shape, but them sitting in the middle. How do you kind of direct questions to a group? The most important thing there is getting them to write down names and think about it's like that, how to win friends and influence people. How do you remember each person's name and then use their name a lot, because then it helps pick on them, but also makes them feel more comfortable. How do you manage that silence, especially in a group setting? Dominant voice is probably the most tricky thing in focus groups. How do you make sure that you're not hearing too much from one person and making sure you're opening it up to everyone? And with all of it, it's mock focus groups, example focus groups, practicing it, seeing it. There's really good online videos. I mean, Vice did a really good series of focus groups, which are a little bit more like contentious or whatever. But focus groups are a thing that makes really good TV as well. So there are really good examples online of focus groups that are compelling and interesting to watch and actually serve as a really good example of how you might want to do this. And then also with interviews and focus groups, just recording the quality check, right? But this is more important with focus groups because you might have one recording device and you have 60 people, so you really have to check the quality of the recording. With the focus group setups, so we talk about crescent seating, recording devices. I mean, you can just do one if it's a really quiet space, but for to make sure you could do 2 in 2 different areas, work it out. Name cards is a good way, especially if a young person is worried about not remembering everyone's name, just having participants' name. But it also allows participants to know each other's names so they can address each other more easily, which is the most important bit. Same stuff, materials ready. In terms of optimal group size, we tend to say 5 to 8 participants. Under 5 can be a bit tricky, like sitting in a restaurant with no one else in there. You're aware that everyone can hear everything you say. When you've got more people in the focus group, people feel a little bit more open to having a conversation. We tend to find focus groups with 4 or less tend to be just like one at a time talking, and that's not what a focus group is really about. But over 8, over 10, you can do it if your peer researcher is really good at facilitating, but it just becomes a much greater facilitation challenge, especially keeping on time and going through the topic guide at a decent rate. What we find is if the facilitator can't handle that many young people, you'll get through the first half of the interview guide, and then the last half you'll run out of time for. So making sure that you're keeping on track, so you're covering everything that you need to cover. And then I'm just going to talk about archetypes, and this is just kind of a way of getting young people to think about some of the challenges that they would face. The main one being dominating. How do you deal and how do you intervene with someone who is really dominating the conversation? That's why names are really important, because then you go, oh, thank you, Diane. Can I just hear Jonathan, I know you haven't said anything. What do you think about the topic? Blah, 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 blah. Silent ones as well, same specific thing, learning how do you bring them in? How do you get them to talk a little bit more? The Joker, there's always one who is reducing those kind of serious questions into jokes. How do you refocus, reframe, but don't play that teacher role where you're like telling them off or being visibly displeased at them disrupting it, but how do you use that energy and kind of make it a more kind of fun environment to be in? Um, the agreeable, the challenger, the oversharer, they're all kind of archetypes, but it's about when you're doing those practice sessions with them, giving those roles to different people in the room so they get an experience of how you manage that and what that looks like in practice as well. Staff support, very similar to interviews, setting it up, doing the in-person stuff, being in the room. I think focus groups, you always need to be in the room, especially if it goes a little bit out of hand. So I think you far more are needed to kind of step in, especially if the volume rises and the facilitator kind of doesn't have a handle on the conversation. It goes a little bit over, but making sure you've got those signals with the peer researcher as well. We also find generally we have a practitioner or staff actually co-chair the focus group with them, just to make sure that the code of conduct and all of the behavior stuff is managed, but the peer researcher still does those questions as well. And the structured group debrief as well. We don't just do the debrief with the peer researcher, we do it with the focus group afterwards. How did that find? Were the questions okay? All of that stuff as well. So we generally find you have kind of two staff members. You do one to support the actual session and escalations, and then one with the participants who need to step out or if there are anything that presents during the project. Examples of focus groups. So NACRO did one where they did it in a setting where the staff facilitator kind of set those ground rules and emphasized that their participation and in the focus group didn't have any bearing on the decisions being made. That's more just a, ground rules, consent, code of conduct role. NSPCC did online focus groups with via Teams. They agreed those norms, and with online, it's particularly important that you focus on those norms. Cameras on, raising hands, one voice at a time. Please don't take it on a bus. Find a quiet space. All of that stuff is really important. Online focus groups are my least favorite thing to do because they are the most difficult, and you have to do far more prep to make sure that people are participating and ready to participate. London Youth did one with young people and volunteering, and they found a dominator archetype in their first focus group. And they had to specifically retrain facilitators, right? In how do you deal with that specifically? That is probably the most common problem with focus groups. And then Peabody Trust Estate Regeneration, they did focus groups in a community centre of the estate being regenerated. And that was about doing it in that community space, right? And then that links the impact of the research very specifically to space and place, which makes it feel far more immediate, far more relevant, because you're going, look, what you're going to say to us today is going to impact literally the building that you're sitting in, right? So it's making sure that the setting is private, quiet, all of that, but also think about how you use the space of the place in a focus group to reinforce the purpose of the research. And that focuses people far more in participating fully. I've got two more sections. I'm going to talk quickly about online survey platforms, just because we don't, and there is guidance around that, but we don't tend to get peer researchers doing surveys themselves. There you can do it, especially in person, as we said, but generally we find there's a lot of risks involved, and online it works pretty well. There are some basic ones like Google Forms. It's really, really simple, but the problem is it's really limited in terms of design. And I don't just mean design of questions, although that is a problem, but in just terms of how it looks and how it works on a mobile, it's not great. There's Microsoft Forms, especially if your organization has Office 365. I tend to find it's better than Google Forms. Google Forms also tend to be rejected by certain school computers and things like that. Depends on what their systems are. SurveyMonkey is kind of the most famous one. SurveyMonkey is great, but it tends to be really, really expensive. And we actually find it works less well than Typeform for young people. SurveyMonkey has more functionality in terms of survey types and how you handle the data and give referral links and all of this. There's more you can do with SurveyMonkey, but one, it's more expensive, and two, it tends to be uglier, right? young people tend to think it looks more dated than Typeform. Typeform, it can be more visual, the design is clearer, and we tend to use Typeform because we find it has much better response rates, right? Um, but again, it can be expensive if you're doing huge amounts of scale. But I think within the youth sector, you're not seeing the level of scale that it would create too expensive problems. And there's also like institutional stuff, right? There's Qualitrix, local authorities have their own survey systems as well. It depends on the stakeholders that you're working with. I would always try and just use Typeform, and if you don't have a budget, use Google Forms. But you might want to do an institutional one, right? We will go through that additional effort to get it on an institutional platform through the local authority, even if it's uglier, even if it's got worse functionality, just because the fact that it has the website link being from the local authority or being from that institution, that tends to drive up a lot more completion rate anyway. So that's the preferred if that is the case. In terms of distribution and response rates, there are so many ways of doing it. None of this will be particularly surprising. WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp broadcasts, partner emails, targeting external partners to really push out the survey with their young people and thinking about the incentive for the organizations to do that. The young person intercept, getting them to go to a space with a laptop or a tablet to do it really, really quickly, making sure you track those demographics. You send reminders as well, especially if they haven't completed it. Some platforms will allow you to see who started it but not completed it, and then you can do some follow-up stuff. And then set and communicate a firm closing date. I mean, this always changes. Loads of organizations push back the firm closing date if they don't have enough. But there's something about the communications power of being like, this closes in 5 days, this closes in 3 days, et cetera, et cetera. The only other thing I would say that's not talked about as much because there doesn't tend to be budgets is social media advertising. We did 2 projects where we advertised on Instagram and Facebook to do the survey with a prize draw. It's tricky because it depends on the topic. If the topic is deemed political, there is a lot more administrative hoops to jump through. You need to show your registered charity number. You need to provide a UK ID and all of this stuff. The lead time in terms of getting those adverts approved is far longer. But they can be super, super effective, especially Facebook adverts nowadays with Instagram. We would probably, I think we spent about £400-500 on Instagram adverts, and we got response rate for 3,000 young people across London, right? So it's really, really effective. And actually, it's terrifying from a data privacy perspective how niche you can get. You can target specific groups, specific demographics, specific ages, specific locations, which makes me really worry about data privacy. But actually, as a tool of getting survey distribution, it is really effective. But you tend to need to know what you're doing, and it's a really difficult thing to learn. So you might want to get a media agency or a PR firm or whatever just to do just the advertising for the survey. That might be something you want to consider, especially if you're looking to get thousands of young people doing it. Last 2 slides, just talking about outreach and quality check. It's always thinking about your outreach plan, and I would do this with the young people. This is why I do this last, because it's the thing that you sit down with them and think about, okay, what do the next 2 months look like? We've talked about how you define those sample targets, but also mapping out all those different recruitment routes. Like, what are you actually doing? Okay, we're going to do the mail list. Which mailing lists are we going to do? Name and contact, but also roles and responsibilities. Which peer researcher is responsible for which recruitment route? This peer researcher goes to this youth club all the time. They're going to do the in-person stuff. This peer researcher is interested in graphic design. They're going to design the survey advertising that goes online, right? What are those roles and responsibilities for each of them? Building that timeline, and then also what's the target for each timeline? If you're going to reach a sample of 400 young people and you've got 4 weeks, then roughly it should be 100 young people a week or whatever it is. So you make sure that you're tracking and you're on point to get to where you want to go. And also planning for failure, right? This is why we always say kind of have a higher target, because then if you drop 20% below that target, then it's kind of fine. But what are the problems that you might anticipate? If a peer research drops out, if a venue no longer does it, if your key contact in a school basically disappears or is too busy with exam season, and a lot of your recruitment strategy for participants rested on the school, then what are you going to do? It's that risk assessment of, once you've done that mapping of your recruitment routes, what are the risks of each, and how is it being complemented with additional approaches? And then ensuring data quality, right? And the fieldwork stage, is the most important. If you do the analysis with terrible data, it's not great and you might have to go back. So making sure that when you're doing the fieldwork stage, you get it right the first time. And the first one's listening to early recordings. I'm guilty of this. I will do a bunch of interviews and I won't listen to the recordings until 2 weeks before the field analysis stage. That's not best practice though, right? It's just more of a capacity challenge. If you can, listen to every recording as you go along if you weren't sitting in the room, right? So you can think about how those interviews went and what else you need to ask. Do those spot checks as well. Make sure the transcripts are produced as quickly as possible. Also, it means you can delete the audio recording within 2 to 3 weeks as well and put that in your consent. But then you can also pick up peer researcher challenges, if they're doing something leading or they're not asking a follow-up on something that's really simple or interesting, making sure you pick that up. Data saturation monitoring, this is what I mean by not seeing anything new, right? So making sure that you're still getting new themes and new topics. And if you start to exhaust that, if you listen to 5 recordings and you exhaust that, maybe you don't need to do another 5 interviews or whatever it is, right? So listening to those recordings, checking those survey results will also give you a sense of actually how on target are you, not in terms of a generic objective number of people that you want to reach, but in terms of a representativeness of that sample. And then lastly, peer research quality feedbacks, right? Just asking them how it goes, having some way of them feeding back after each interview, how it went as well, and how do you track that? So you can make sure that, how many of the interviews went well, but also which parts of the interview guide is working, or, survey platforms have a fantastic way of seeing where people drop out at certain questions as well. So if you find that they do all of it and then they get to question 8 and they all drop out question 8, that enables you to think about, okay, how do we change that to make sure we're getting a full completion? So it's just making sure that you have a plan of how you're tracking it and what needs to be done after each bit of field work.